This material presents a compelling framework arguing that the successful deployment of AI agents in finance relies entirely on building a specialized human governance layer composed of entirely new operational roles. Right off the bat, the deep expertise here is obvious, especially in defining the governance gap, but I want to dive straight into our first major area for structural enhancement.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get right into it.
So, the current structure leaves a functional gap between identifying organizational readiness and actually deploying the specific human roles required to address those readiness dimensions.
Right. The weakness here is that the piece introduces the agent readiness assessment as just a standalone checklist. I mean, it covers process clarity, data quality, governance, and human capability, but it's largely decoupled from the four specific new roles.
Exactly. Because these two really heavy frameworks are isolated, the reader is kind of left to guess which newly minted role is responsible for fixing which specific readiness gap.
Which makes the assessment feel, highly theoretical rather than actively operational.
Yeah, so the suggestion for improvement is to integrate the four readiness dimensions directly into the definitions and operational roadmap of the four specific roles, demonstrating exactly how these new human capabilities actively resolve the readiness gaps.
I like that. We should give some concrete examples of how to execute this structural change, like starting with the first dimension, process clarity. Right now, it just sits alone in the assessment section.
Right. We need to explicitly map process clarity to the daily responsibilities of the agent architect.
Oh, absolutely. That mapping instantly gives the agent architect a tangible mandate. I mean, when we talk about a lack of process clarity in traditional finance, we are usually talking about legacy workflows that exist entirely in a senior accountant's head.
Yeah, the process isn't documented at all.
Exactly. It relies purely on human intuition honed over, 20 years. So an agent architect's primary concrete value is taking that undocumented, tacit knowledge and translating it into explicit, machine-readable logic.
By defining the agent architect this way, we show the reader how the role actively neutralizes the process clarity gap, and we see this again with the second dimension, which is governance infrastructure.
Right. The material mentions monitoring systems and audit logging mechanisms.
But these systems don't run themselves, you know? We can tie this infrastructure directly to the agent performance manager. The text currently notes that this manager monitors outputs against quality standards, which is a bit vague.
Yeah, it is. The concrete example here is detailing how this specific role utilizes those exact audit logging mechanisms to catch performance degradation in the AI model before a hallucinated tax calculation hits the general ledger.
Which is a nightmare scenario. We need to explain the mechanics of that monitoring. The agent performance manager isn't just reading retrospective monthly reports.
Right. They are looking at live telemetry.
Exactly. If the agent's confidence score in categorizing a specific cross-border transaction suddenly drops from 99% to 70%, the performance manager uses the governance infrastructure to intercept that action.
The human role and the technological infrastructure are entirely codependent. And that same interdependency applies to the third dimension, data quality.
Oh, for sure. The text brings up the necessity of a clean core enterprise resource planning system, a clean core ERP, alongside a canonical data model.
It states what is needed, but it entirely skips how this data quality foundation empowers the governance layer.
Right. So we could connect this data quality requirement directly to the foundations required by the compliance intelligence officer. If that compliance intelligence officer doesn't have a clean core ERP, their job becomes functionally impossible.
Yeah, because a clean core ERP prevents layers of custom legacy code from obscuring data provenance. When a regulatory anomaly occurs, the compliance intelligence officer needs to trace that anomaly back to its exact origin within seconds.
And if the ERP is riddled with undocumented workarounds and 20 years of custom patches, the AI will inevitably ingest warped data.
Exactly. And the human officer won't be able to reconstruct the agent's decision-making process. Explaining that mechanism demonstrates why the data quality dimension must be solved for the compliance officer to exist.
By mapping the readiness checklist directly to the job descriptions, we hand the CFO an executable roadmap rather than just a theoretical white paper. But, a blueprint doesn't build a house. You can invent the title of Compliance Intelligence Officer, but you can't just pluck that person out of thin air. The argument effectively advocates for transitioning existing finance professionals into agent governance roles, but it stops short of illustrating the practical, day-to-day mechanics of how this evolution occurs.
Yeah, the weakness in the text right now is its heavy reliance on abstract phrases. It uses terms like deliberate investment or technical curiosity and multi-year organizational development.
Which are accurate at a macro level, but these high-level terms completely fail to provide finance leaders with a tangible blueprint for upskilling a traditional tax specialist or an execution-focused controller into an agent architect.
Right, the specific how-to is missing. A chief financial officer cannot issue a corporate mandate for technical curiosity. They need a mechanical process for capability development.
So the suggestion for improvement is to ground the theoretical capability development path with practical transitional milestones, detailing specific stepping stone experiences that bridge the gap between traditional execution and future governance.
But I struggle to buy the text's core premise completely here. The author argues this is purely an organizational design issue, stating explicitly that this transition is, quote, not a training course.
Yeah, that stood out to me too.
Right? I mean, you can alter the org chart and shuffle reporting lines all you want, but if you eliminate structured training, aren't you just leaving a massive vacuum where actual skill acquisition is supposed to happen?
You absolutely are, which is why the concrete examples here need to fill that vacuum with experiential learning models. Let's look at how we take a current compliance manager and physically turn them into a compliance intelligence officer.
Okay, yeah.
We could suggest a transitional shadowing phase. During an initial AI agent deployment, future compliance intelligence officers are pulled out of their daily financial routines and physically sit alongside the IT and systems engineering teams.
Oh, I see. So they aren't learning to code in Python, but they are absorbing the system architecture.
Exactly. They are watching how a rigid regulatory constraint, like a changing tax threshold in a foreign jurisdiction, is translated into a specific code block or a system parameter. That shadowing period is a concrete transitional milestone.
That makes sense. A shadowing phase solves the initial exposure problem. But what about the exception intelligence specialist? The text notes they handle the cases that agents escalate, the genuinely ambiguous regulatory gray areas where the machine fails.
Right, which is a huge shift. When someone's entire financial career has been predicated on following rigid, black-and-white accounting rules, how do you abruptly transition them into a role defined entirely by ambiguity and exception handling?
We could propose a sandbox validation period as the stepping stone. Before the enterprise AI agent ever goes live in a production environment, the future exception intelligence specialists are placed in a closed sandbox environment.
So their full-time job for a month is to review and manually validate historical agent decisions running against past data?
Exactly. They see what the agent gets right, but critically, they study the exact types of bizarre anomalies the agent fails at.
Because an AI doesn't fail the way a human junior accountant fails.
Right. It fails in highly confident, statistically alien ways. By reviewing thousands of these anomalies in a sandbox, the human worker builds the statistical intuition for machine error without ever risking live enterprise data.
That sandbox builds the exact muscle memory they need for the future state. And then we have the agent architect, the person actually designing the logic for the agent ecosystem. Right now, the organization just has a traditional controller who understands the workflow.
So how do they cross the chasm from executing a process to architecting a machine's process?
We should recommend the creation of internal domain-to-logic translation workshops. And these are not software engineering boot camps where accountants learn syntax.
Right, they are targeted sessions where current financial controllers are taught a new language for the knowledge they already possess.
We need to describe what that translation actually looks like in the text. For example, a controller might intuitively know to check vendor history if an invoice variance is over 5%.
So the workshop teaches them how to document that tacit intuition into machine-readable parameters, defining the anomaly as a strict standard deviation from a trailing 90-day average.
Exactly. It forces the human to break down their own subconscious decision-making into explicit decision trees.
Detailing the translation workshops, the sandbox validation, and the IT shadowing completely fills the vacuum left by the dismissal of traditional training courses. It shows the reader the transition in motion.
But as we move from upskilling individuals in a sandbox into deploying them in a live corporate environment, another reality sets in: This organizational shift won't happen in a pristine vacuum. The material envisions a perfectly rational organizational adoption of these new capabilities, completely overlooking the inevitable human friction, resistance, and cross-departmental tension this transition will cause.
Yeah, the weakness is the assumption that current finance professionals will eagerly drop their legacy work to embrace governance roles, and that other departments will smoothly accept these new titles encroaching on their territory.
The text completely ignores the profound psychological resistance from finance veterans who will likely feel their legacy execution skills are being devalued.
It also ignores the highly probable jurisdictional clashes between the newly minted finance agent architects and the traditional enterprise IT or data science departments.
The suggestion for improvement is to acknowledge this internal organizational friction directly within the text, providing the target audience, those finance leaders, with strategic advice on navigating the cultural shift and negotiating these interdepartmental boundaries.
Let's tackle the cross-departmental tension first. The text describes the agent architects as someone who designs the agent ecosystem and decides how agents interact with enterprise systems.
Right, and if I am the chief information officer reading this, I am immediately throwing up a massive roadblock, because that sounds exactly like what my enterprise IT systems architects do.
We need to give the CFO a strategic script to preempt that roadblock. The concrete example is to include a dedicated section addressing the exact boundary line between the finance team's agent architect and the IT team's system developers.
The text must frame this relationship explicitly as a business logic versus technical infrastructure partnership. The finance architect owns the what and the why. They dictate the tax logic, the compliance thresholds, and the business rules the agent must follow.
And the IT architect owns the how, the API integrations, the server loads, the latency issues, and the security protocols. Drawing that hard boundary line in the material gives the finance leader the exact vocabulary they need to negotiate jurisdiction with the technology department.
Giving them the vocabulary for that negotiation is crucial because turf wars stall more AI deployments than bad software. But the friction isn't just external to the finance department, it's internal. Let's look at the psychological resistance from the legacy staff.
Yeah, if a professional has spent 20 years becoming the fastest, most accurate reconciliation accountant in the firm, and suddenly they are told a machine is doing the reconciliation and their new job is just to monitor the machine's output, they are going to feel like their craftsmanship has been stolen.
They might view the governance role as a glorified babysitter for a piece of software.
Overcoming that feeling of demotion requires a massive psychological shift, and the text needs to offer strategies for changing the prestige dynamics within the department. A concrete example is advising the reader on how to reframe and market these roles internally.
Instead of framing the exception intelligence specialist as a cleanup crew that handles the machine's garbage output, the text should advise framing it as an elite, high-prestige escalation tier.
Think of it as the financial equivalent of a Supreme Court. They only hear the hardest, most complex, high-stakes cases that the lower courts, the AI agents, lack the jurisdiction or capability to resolve.
If you frame the role as an elite unit requiring the highest level of human judgment, veteran professionals will fight to earn that title rather than resisting the change.
The text already mentions that these roles require high skill, but translating that into a strategy for internal marketing is what the CFO actually needs.
Finally, we have to address the pure anxiety of letting go. Traditional financial controllers are, by necessity, control freaks. Their entire professional worth is tied to ensuring the numbers are perfect. They want to touch every cell in the spreadsheet.
So, how do you strategically advise a leader to manage the loss of control anxiety when handing high-volume operational tasks over to an autonomous machine?
You can't just flip a switch and demand trust. The text should discuss implementing a phased transition to manage this specific anxiety. We could provide a concrete strategy where controllers maintain a strict manual override authority during the first 6 months of the agent's deployment.
In this phase, the AI agent queues up thousands of actions and recommendations, but it cannot execute them until the human controller physically reviews and clicks approve on the dash.
The human still holds the keys. Over those 6 months, as the controller sees the agent succeed consistently, the manual override requirement is slowly dialed back.
acknowledging that trust in an autonomous system takes time to build, and providing a structured handover period makes the entire organizational framework infinitely more realistic.
Let's synthesize the core takeaways from this analysis. This piece offers a highly practical framework for the future of finance, but its ultimate utility relies on addressing the mechanical realities of the human transition. The impact will be maximized by acting on 3 structural enhancements.
First, integrate the readiness assessment directly with the 4 new roles, ensuring readers know exactly which title is responsible for resolving which readiness gap.
Second, replace abstract phrases about capability development with concrete stepping stones like sandboxes, shadowing, and translation workshops.
And third, confront the inevitable human friction by defining clear jurisdictional boundaries with IT, reframing the prestige of the new roles to prevent legacy staff resistance, and building in structured handover periods to manage anxiety.
For the listener looking to apply this feedback immediately, the actionable summary starts with mapping your 4 readiness dimensions directly to the new job descriptions to create an executable mandate.
Next, sketch out the parameters of a sandbox training phase for your future exception intelligence specialists so they can begin building statistical intuition for machine error safely.
Finally, prepare a distinct change management strategy by drafting the exact boundary lines you will use to negotiate system ownership with your technology department.
Implement these changes, and the text becomes a rigorous, actionable roadmap rather than just a theoretical organizational model.
We warmly invite you to refine these sections based on this discussion and submit the material back to us for another round of feedback. Keep building, and we'll see you next time.